Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard and DevOps.com webinar. We're excited that you're here, that you've joined us. Our topic today is open source security, weighing the pros and cons. And we have three amazing panelists lined up for you today. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'll serve as your host and moderator. A few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, and we will send out an email with a link to the recording following the webinar. You can also get it on securityboulevard.com, so please visit our site there. So also our panelists love questions. I'm going to be throwing some questions out to them, but of course we'd love to hear from you also. So please put your questions into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar software. So let's move on to our topic, open source security, weighing the pros and cons. I would like to introduce our panelists for today. Here we go, change the slides. First up is Patrick McNeil. Patrick is a solution architect with Veracode. And we have joining him with us, Jeffrey Martin. Jeffrey is Director of Product at WhiteSource. And also we have Vikram Verakantan, who is Head of Products at Lacework. Welcome all three of you. Let's start out by having you introduce yourselves. Just give us a little bit of information about you. Patrick, would you start?
Sure, thanks, Mitch. So I'm a principal solutions architect for key accounts. So I basically help Veracode's largest customers get their application security programs off the ground, inclusive of open source security.
Great. How about you, Jeffrey?
Hi, I'm Director of Product over at WhiteSource. We make open source management solutions, and I'm an expert also in privacy and software quality.
Fantastic. Vikram.
Thank you, Mitch. Hi, good morning, folks. My name is Vikram Verakantan. I'm a Head of Products at Lacework. My responsibilities include looking at the overall product security to include open source adoption and guide our customers in terms of how do they operationalize different security elements in their stack.
Great. Well, I'm going to throw open, kind of put the gauntlet out here first and just ask the kind of elephant in the room question. Is open source more secure? Is it less secure? There's a lot of maybe myth and reality to that question. Vikram, do you want to jump in on that one first?
There's a lot of different aspects of looking at any software security. I would not necessarily say that whether open source or proprietary software has best of breed from a security perspective. My experience has been you got to take a look at the software, the issues associated around with that software, and have the necessary processes and policies in place to be able to handle the inherent vulnerabilities or the inherent security issues associated with each one of them.
Okay, Jeffrey, love to hear your thoughts as well.
So the short answer, I think, is it depends, because it should be inherently more secure because all of the problems are disclosed and fixed. But that does sort of put it on the actual user of the open source to keep things updated, which traditionally we're not so great at. So in that case, if you don't keep it up to date with the fixes, basically you're using software that has vulnerabilities that are published publicly. So it can be more secure as long as you have the right practices around it. Other than that, it's less secure.
Now, just a thought about that, Jeffrey. Is it that the users of open source aren't updating to the latest version that has those fixes, or is it a matter of how frequently the open source itself, how quickly it is getting fixed?
Generally, people don't disclose the vulnerabilities until they're fixed, but the actual users of open source aren't, let's just say, perfect at keeping up to date minute by minute. A week or two can go by, or everybody remembers Apache struts. Lots and lots of people were out of date.
Yeah, I'm not sure I keep the oil in my car changed frequently, more or less, all my open source.
I know I don't.
How about you, Patrick? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll definitely agree with Jeffrey in that, we don't do such a great job of keeping up to date, but typically since there's a lot of innovation happening in open source and people contribute frequently, it can be more secure. We see a lot of corporate software that goes unmaintained and it's just dead for a really long period of time. And I would argue that for those that say they're not using open source and they're all completely closed source, they need to go check again because we're pretty much guaranteeing that they are using open source. They just don't know it yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. There will be an ebook that'll accompany the email going out. Some interesting stats, I think, came from White Source from your company, Jeffrey. Open source components make up to 60 to 80% of the code base in modern applications. So that's a lot. I mean, that you would think it might be 10 or 20%, but sounds like it's a huge element, especially if you think about Kubernetes and Linux and all kinds of software that might be in that stack.
Right. Modern architecture is open source for the most part.
Interesting. So say some more why that's the case.
I think it's just really because we all, as an industry, have become dependent on certain key, pieces of functionality, and those tend to be open source. Kubernetes is a perfect example, but I mean, just look at all of the open source that Amazon uses. Certainly a controversy right now with how much they use, but at the end of the day, our infrastructure really does run on other people's work.
Yeah, and we rely on other people's work for rapid prototyping and getting to market maybe faster than our competitors. We're just keeping pace, with what's required from our user base. And I'll definitely agree with Jeffrey's analysis of percentage of composition of open source products, I guess, in that the Veracode State of Software Security report showed somewhere around 88% of applications, at least for Java applications, were open source components. We see it a little bit lower in some other languages. Probably Java's got the highest.
And really, it's a symptom of a bigger overall movement where software is becoming increasingly composed instead of coded. It's a lot easier to put together other people's Lego bricks to build a house than it is to build a house from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
I have kids, sorry.
I think that's a great point. That's a great point, Jeffrey. I think the idea of leveraging components out there to really scale up the acceleration of delivery, not just from a software perspective. On our side on Lacework, we see quite a bit of adoption of container technologies. Docker is the mainstream. I would say, a year ago or 2 years ago, probably it was more niche. Now, right now, we see a lot more push towards really using open source technologies to be able to push the envelope of delivery. Kubernetes is the new kid in the block. We see quite a bit of movement towards Kubernetes, and all of it really boils down to I can pick pieces of the open source software and really deliver acceleration to the business needs. That's really what is driving a lot of this adoption, both at a software stack level and an infrastructure stack level as well.
And for quote unquote free.
For free.
Quote unquote free.
Mm-hmm.
Free as a beer, the whole argument. Patrick, I know one of the things that I read in the ebook that our listeners, our participants will receive. You talked a lot about the innovation that's happening around open source. And of course, Oracle, Amazon, Microsoft, everybody, right, is adopting it in whatever their appropriate ways, whether it's using it or contributing to it. Do you think more innovation is happening in open source than actually in commercial products itself?
I personally, I think so. Given the fact that you do see companies wanting to open source their products, I mean, they're I'd say looking for free work, because the more people that contribute to their code base and start using their systems, the more stickiness you've got. You build that ecosystem of people who want to use the same framework or stack, and it just kind of helps them. If they're a commercial provider, helps them gain user base. And if they're just looking at doing it for the love of open source, same thing.
It's interesting. There are different motivations. Can you speak to some of the motivations? Why might a Microsoft do open source? Why might a Google, of course, with Kubernetes, for example? Why would they pursue an open source strategy?
Well, I think they do get a larger base of people contributing, so you can expand the functionality a little bit faster. Plus, there are developers that are experts in particular areas. So now you have access to experts that maybe you can't necessarily hire, but you can get them to contribute to your project in the one niche area that they're really good at.
Right. Jeffrey, Vikram, similar thoughts, or you see it a little differently?
The idea of developer, bringing in something very interesting to the table is very, very appealing. What we are seeing on our side is, The Kubernetes is an interesting aspect. Most of our infrastructure team who started looking at Kubernetes adoption very early on were primarily motivated with the idea that I can understand this code, I can look at the code, I can understand the limitations or the limits of this thing, so I can really take a more authoritative answer towards operationalizing this thing. That was very interesting, and some of them went on to become core contributors as well. That's been used as a recruiting tool in one sense. We've seen companies that are using an open source projects as a recruiting tool. The other side is, I think, Patrick, what you laid out is it brings different perspectives, and being able to contribute to those perspectives really brings a multifaceted development approach to an open source project, and that's very fascinating. Something like Kubernetes is both scale and efficiency. It's amazing to see that a lot of people are contributing to both sides of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I like Patrick's point, honestly, about the specialization, right? If somebody has a specific skill, it's not worth bringing them on, full time for a project or something like that. Open source does allow you to just sort of contribute a little bit of code, tiny bit, move on. You can go around and, maybe you're an open source security expert and you contribute security fixes to a lot of open source projects.
Speaking of that, I'm curious about your perspective on this. Is there a difference in how vulnerabilities are reported because something is open source versus a commercial product? Is it much more accepted, less kind of the, the pride of authorship with open source versus, kind of trying to protect things if you're a commercial product? Or is there really much difference in how vulnerabilities are treated when they're reported?
I'll take this one. My view is that generally open source tends to be a little bit more, forgive the pun, but open about their vulnerabilities. I guess that's not really surprising. It's built into the DNA that people share data. Whereas most corporate and commercial software, it's kind of the opposite. We build it so that we don't disclose our data. That applies to quality and security. And honestly, open source does tend to be a little bit more forthcoming about it, a lot more sharey, and they'll even talk to other projects and share similar problems.
So I guess I'll disagree with that in some respects, in that while there are certainly some projects that are very security conscious, there's a lot of others that were started and don't necessarily have that experience in, how do you handle a disclosure when it comes in, and what do I do about it? How do I prioritize a fix for it? And commercial software, companies are typically motivated to complying with, standards on reporting. So there's typically a security at email address. You don't necessarily see that for open source projects. And I guess if you haven't been keeping up to date on the inclusions in your own software, the packages you're using, and you're using a project that's been dead and relatively unmaintained for some time, there may not be anybody left to really report something to.
Fair enough. I mean, at the end of the day, open source isn't exactly renowned for process and procedures and
Nope.
policies.
I think I agree with both of you, and the kind of middle ground here is that in general motivation, my observation with open source project is like the scrutiny that brings in with being open. Most people in their best interest wants to put out the best software out there, want to do their best in terms of security. But in general, unless they are like a very large project like a React that has a sponsorship of a very large company behind it, some of these most popular projects may or may not have the necessary processes, procedures, and the resources to be able to actually go through the process of security audit, evaluation, and monitoring and management. It's a middle ground. The motivations exist, the resources may or may not be there. So.
Very good.
I'll agree with that.
Well, I don't know if you guys watched the old show, Whose Line Is It Anyway, where the rules are made up and the points don't matter. 1,000 points, Patrick, for disagreeing, and 100 points, Vikram, for being peacemaker on that.
I'm winning.
So far, well, again, the points don't matter anyway. But,
If we have to sing a hoedown, I'm out.
I'm looking forward. We're definitely doing one then.
Who's a celebrity guest?
There you go. We're going to try to get Robin Williams to come back, from his ghost of him. Anyway, whole nother subject. So, with the transparency, the thing about open source, so many wonderful, great things, right? Not dissing it at all. There's also a lot of mythology around it too, and there's a reality to it. Sometimes it is mythology. One of them is around transparency and the value of that. But there can be some disadvantages to transparency. Like, is it easier for someone to maybe inject some malware and trying to get that into the code base? And we all assume everybody's watching and looking at things closely, but is that really true? Is it possible for someone to get malware, inside some open source code base? Who wants to take that?
Well, it's certainly possible with open source, but it's also possible with commercial software. Um, we have seen recent instances where people have gotten developer accounts and then contributed to open source projects, like the recent issue with Ruby Gems. You're seeing similar things with npm.js and PyPy. So it's certainly possible. And then I just saw a story that came out this morning that somebody was trying to inject some malware into the CC cleaner, and they managed to catch it before it came in. So it's definitely possible on both sides. And I think really the motivation for doing it in open source is so it eventually does make its way into closed source.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of two different attacks that targeted just cryptocurrency. I think both through NPM. One was like Electron, and can't remember the other one. It was a couple of years back. But at the end of the day, it's like everything else on the internet. Anonymity breeds bad behavior. And at the end of the day, that's if you can put your own code into other people's code and they don't know who you are, you're going to end up with that kind of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I think in general sense, the transparency is great, that it allows you to be able to audit it and things like that. But it's time and time again, we have seen like as early as, last week, the graboid in the Docker images. The motivations does exist to, most popular projects have some level of scrutiny, but at the same time, the software, the supply chain attacks, as you would call it, has motivations both on the closed source side as well as the open source side. The open source, depending on the project, depending upon the policies of the project, how they, take a core contribution into the picture. The open source is probably more susceptible in this area than the closed source side, mainly because of the, the transparency associated with the project. But end of the day, it comes down to us, like, how do you operationalize it? How are you putting the governing principles around? How to use the software within your environment really matters.
One thing is the window does tend to be a little bit smaller with open source because, well, the source is open. You can see what it's doing. Whereas commercial, it can sit there until somebody notices it internally at a company, or a problem happens and somebody traces it back.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to go to some of the due diligence and process that I think Vikram kind of hinted to. But before we do that, a lot of companies are starting to use this open core approach, which essentially is, here's a part of our product or the core components of our product that are open source. And then through the commercial version is where you get the other capabilities. Hopefully it's not crippleware, but what do you think of that kind of a strategy for open source? Is that valuable as someone is consuming the open source, or is it not really enough and you really want to stick with just a pure open source project if you're going to use open source?
I think it really depends on how much of the source is truly open. If they've released everything and it's completely open, then there's really not all that many differences between open core versus a regular open source project. The concept of open core is really more one of licensing and whatever support model they've put in, rather than having a piece of the system that's completely closed and other parts that are open.
Yeah, I don't think all open core is quite the same either. There is a difference between a company sponsoring an open source project and being inherently kind of hands off, in which case it's basically an open source project, or somebody who really, it's all their developers working on the open source project and it's really owned by the commercial entity. In my experience, those kinds of open core, they tend to be less focused on security and more focused on things like feature delivery and frankly, moving quickly to meet your corporate overlords' demands. Having been one of those corporate overlords, I can say that.
Okay. 100 points for the corporate overlords, Jeffrey. So.
But look, at the end of the day, open source is open, so it really does depend on how in depth that commercial entity really is holding the reins on the direction of that project.
And who's contributing to it, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a bunch of corporate people being paid to contribute to open source, they're going to follow the procedures and policies that are normal in corporate America.
I mean,
Great.
from a general market perspective, I do agree with Jeffrey. There are really two directions in terms of when you say true open source versus an open core product that has, a larger appeal. From a product standpoint, I think open core is an interesting aspect to gain user adoption, to build a community around it, and drive, as the complexity of use becomes a forefront, you start to drive towards more of a commercial offering at that point. It's, for all intents and purposes, it's a better user acquisition problem statement versus an actual true open source. In terms of going with the general body of open source principles, it's more centered around being able to build a customer base that you can monetize over time. So,
oh yeah, it's all about lead flows and developer credibility, etc.
Well, it does go to the kind of business model, right, of the company. Is it sort of a freemium, and is that freemium an open core, or is it just a free version of the product? And are there additional advantages that the company is providing to the user base by it being open, or is it just a delivery model, right? Does it kind of boil down to that, or am I on track here?
100% on track from my point of view, Mitch. You get 200 points.
All right. Well, you get 100 back for, for being nice to the moderator. Okay. So let's get into some of the what should you do in adopting open source. We live in a world now where you have to be careful what you use, code libraries, open source, whatever it is. And as casual as we all like to be to say, hey, that looks great, I'd love to download that library, that gem, that open source, whatever it is. But are there some practical things, and I hate to bring up the policy word, but are there some practical things you should use in deciding whether you're going to adopt a certain open source project? What should you consider? Vikram, you want to start out?
Yeah, I think all of us will bring different perspective depending upon our experiences in this particular area. From an open source perspective, generally, our guidance internally here is one is understand the lineage of the project itself. Is the project alive? How many contributions have been going on before we make it a mainstream adoption, make it a part of a core product inclusion? The general, first principles is look at the project, who is contributing to it, who is adopting it across the board, how many contributions, how fresh are those contributions. That's more at the due diligence of is this open source project viable or not, does it have a life or not, right? Beyond that is more about, do you have an actual life cycle around that? Is how do we bring an open source software on? Who reviews and signs off on the licensing of that? How do we do an initial code review? How do we do, what kind of scanning or what kind of evaluation do we do from the get-go? This is more about the operational life cycles of actually start adopting the open source project. Then it passes down into once post-adoption is how do you continue to keep up with the refresh cycles, security incident reviews, and all of these are, part of our operational model today. And more importantly, once it gets into productions, once we are operationalizing that, we maintain a complete 360 degrees feedback loop cycle in terms of does it have vulnerabilities, how often these vulnerabilities are patched. Over time, it's possible that we may need to switch off some of these, and move to a different project, mainly because the project hasn't been patching for, our life cycles are about 2 weeks in terms of being able to address any critical issues. And if you're not falling within those timelines, either we try to fix it, which is where we are taking the burden on ourselves, which over time, gets too much, and we switch over to something that's more updated frequently. So that's what a general sense, to think about is have a policy, have a life cycle model, and continue to follow the life cycle model in terms of the security and general adoption of that open source project.
So let's take what you offered there, Vikram, and kind of think about it in two parts. First, one part being the open source project itself and how do you evaluate it, and the second is what are your internal kind of considerations. So part one, what are the things that you should consider as you're looking at open source project and trying to decide whether you want to adopt that, make a core part of what you're implementing in your code? Jeff, Patrick, you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll jump in because actually I don't view security evaluation of it much different than you would evaluate the quality of it, which is a pretty standardized process nowadays. You would really look at the maturity, how long it's been around, how often it updates. That's very important. And just in general, the size. Is it really, really well adopted? At this point, Kubernetes is not a risky implementation. If it's some library you found that 20 people use, that's going to be a much bigger risk. So those are the three big ones to me: maturity, speed, and adoption.
Yeah, I'll agree with that, Mitch. And I think the other thing to watch is when you look at the project, take a look at the pull requests, see if there are specific things that were introduced for security fixes, just to try to get an understanding of whether they're prioritizing that separately. And you can look at the comments, you can look at the tickets on the project.
Okay,
And
great. Check out the tickets. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I noticed in the question somebody had asked, what type of security controls should open source projects have? And I think a lot of it does start with knowing who your contributors are. Anonymity is not a plus anywhere on the internet, period, if you're trying to look for quality. But in open source, you should know who your contributors are. Don't just let anybody contribute and immediately merge it back in. Get a relationship, let them submit, let them do some documentation first, somehow, some way prove that they're real and that they're not a bad actor.
Yeah, reminds me of, I don't know if you watched The Watchmen last night, the first episode. Who's watching The Watchers, right?
Yeah, honestly. No, I didn't watch the TV show, but old school comic fan, so.
Yeah, I watched the movie before the show, but that's a whole nother topic. Just to kind of jump in here to remind our audience, we do love questions, so appreciate everyone contributing those. Just pop those into the questions tab on your GoToWebinar software. How about that, Jeffrey? Say a little bit more about, you look at the polls, look at the tickets. Do you also need to then, do we have to go through the legwork of saying, okay, it took 3 days on average to fix the last 5 security vulnerabilities? How do you make an assessment based on that information?
I mean, there are ways to go through and put metrics on there. I'm not a big fan of metrics on open source projects. Every project's a little bit different. Every project isn't having the same goals. Some have very, very big goals and needs constant work. Some are solving one specific problem and doesn't need to be updated very much. But in general, you should be able to tell how often they're updating and whether they care. Are tickets being opened, and a lot of times security's private, like keep it quiet until they fix it. But other problems, quality, for instance, great, we have this problem. How fast are they fixing it? Does it take them 2 months? If it takes them 2 months for something that's functional, it's going to take them just as long for security.
Okay, great. Anything else to add, Patrick, Vikram?
I think the only other thing I would add is, like, some projects are very good at documenting the process of security issues, how they handle and who to report and how do they respond to those. It's interesting, like I think Patrick, you mentioned this, is some of them treat the security PRs as totally different than a regular, feature improvement PRs. Those tend to have the most amount of knowledge around how to handle security issues. Those tend to get, better, acceptance from my point of view, because those are serious about security. They have a process around it. They know how to handle things. So.
There also seems to be a bit of a self-policing kind of based around the reputation of a project. It starts to develop a bad rap in the community of, it doesn't get maintained, things don't get fixed. You're probably going to see comments and people talking about that. Is that safe to say?
Absolutely.
I mean, 100%, right? At the end of the day, the whole community talks, and everybody likes to, badmouth each other a little bit. So if they have a reason to, they generally will make it public. But at the end of the day, it does. Security is a function of quality, at least in terms of indication of problems.
Mm-hmm.
Open source, open drama.
Open drama. Okay. There's a new one. Okay. 500 to you again, Patrick. You're taking them away. Okay. Okay. So let's switch then to the other side of this. What are some of the things that you don't want to go overboard with process and decisions and gatekeepers and all that kind of stuff, but what are some of the realistic things you should put in place in deciding, are we going to adopt various open source projects?
make it easy. So developers are not security experts. You need to give them access to the team that's going to be doing evaluations for open source, but B, give them access to a tool so they can look things up on their own. Both the vulnerabilities that have been reported to the National Vulnerability Database, anything that your team or the tool has been able to discover from the actual open source repos themselves, and get your developers automating in the CI/CD pipeline early and often, so they can discover things, and then you can sort of get a handle on those projects that you have in your inventory that you didn't even necessarily know about, so you can go back and reassess them.
I mean, that's a good point. The problem always starts with knowing what you have. At the end of the day, that is the first thing you need to do. And then once you know what you have to be careful what you add in. And that includes both updates to your existing inventory and new libraries, etc. Just fundamentally, most people don't know what they have. That is a clear starting point for most commercial projects. Know what you have, know what those things are calling, so that you can see your entire supply chain as much as you can.
Now, is that through your own repository? I don't know if you're checking in somebody else's open source in your repository, or what's the best way to know what you have?
Give me money and buy my product. But
but look, that was too big of a
but there is a
points to me.
I'm going to disagree with Jeffrey on that one.
But I mean, honestly, there is a lot of ways. There's many tools out there to go and pull your inventory. It's very, very important that it's automated, though. You can't do that manually. There's no need to. There's so many ways to automate inventory building. Go use one of them.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jeffrey. There are many ways, many tools out there. It's pretty well known in terms of, how do you do software inventory. From the process that we follow internally on our side is there's a control point in terms of, what you use and what component do you bring into because of the direct dependency, because you need a certain library, or you bring in certain products that includes other indirect dependencies. There's a control point there. Our process has been, one is, have somebody actually have a control point. In this case, it's our CTO, who basically has a PR process that reviews every PR, that has a review process that goes through the life cycle model. Is one, deciding, is this project viable? Two, does it introduce new risk from a legal standpoint that we are not aware of, that we are not prepared for? Three is, what is the inherent adoption of this software brings to the table? Like, is it vulnerabilities? Is it code quality? Whatever, stability issues. And then the third part of it is actually put it in a sandbox environment, really look at it and see, does it behave like the way it says, the way the product charter calls out for. Surprised to see we have seen some surprises there. There are indirect dependencies that bring to table that they're updating from, some place that we don't want to get updates for. So these are all the things that really boils down to us having a control point and defining what those control point efficiencies are, and how do you want to validate that over time, knowing what you have, what you're bringing to the table, and how you're actually using it. So.
And I mean, automating as much as possible, updates, knowing what's there. At the end of the day, automation is key for speed. No big groundbreaking notice there.
It seems like there may have already been processes in place to look around license management. Is this Apache? Is this GPL? Whatever it might be. Maybe that's a good process to add on to. Is okay. Who's going to decide what
trust the lawyers. Trust the lawyers to really mitigate the risk, right? That's their job. And it really is kind of the same thing, right? What do? They want to know what the licenses are, so they build an inventory, take a look at all the licenses. There's not that much difference between that and going and looking at all the security vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I'll agree with you, Jeffrey, because I typically see that when we come in and try to help people with their open source inventories, they're typically discovering licenses that they didn't know were in use in their products. So it tends to be, two things for the price of one.
Glad to see I'm not the only one that's had that challenge.
I think it's probably everybody.
Yeah.
Good. Vikram, you were talking about the CTO making that decision at your company. Some people discuss kind of the role of security champion for open source, either on projects or at a company. Is that what your CTO does also, or there's other people who kind of play that security champion role?
So that's a great point, Mitch. One of the things that we're observing being a cloud security company is the function of the security as a function is being quite distributed across the board. Gone are the days where there's a centralized security organization who would, put a, guard dogs around what you can do, what cannot do. That kind of does not go well with the world of cloud native world where developers are in charge of moving things around and moving fast. The way we are operating right now is there is an element of who operationalizes security, but everybody in the end is responsible for security. So that function is distributed among developers in regards to how do we do code quality, how are the coding standards there. It's top down, mostly from an education perspective, but there's an individual stakeholders who wear the hat of security from a PR review process, from a patching process perspective. That's cut across dev and operations team on our side. But that's the general nature of how we are observing our customers as well. The concept of DevSecOps or SecDevOps, however we want to call it, is more led through, I'm coming from a product management world. I'm starting to see an interesting relationship being developed. It's security is becoming the product person, and the operations and the dev teams are becoming the engineers. Tell me the directives, what I need to do, and I'll figure out how to do it in the most efficient way possible, rather than you guarding this thing, all through the process. So that's the nature of how cloud native security championships are evolving. Is they're spread between dev and operation teams. They're more focused on speed and agility versus actually the taboo of security. That's really encouraging to see that.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's the same DevOps story, right? The roles are collapsing, for not literally, but in other words, they're being more democratized, right? Everybody's dev and everybody's ops. But there's still a lot of value in specialists. So, a security specialist who is the guy to go to, who knows that subject matter, is important. It's a really valuable skill to have, and it's not a skill everybody on the team has. In the same way you've got a database guy and you end up with, a real good ops monitoring guy. You need a security guy.
Mm-hmm. A lot to say for if everyone owns security, then no one owns it.
Specialists exist for a reason, and acquiring that specialist knowledge takes experience and time, and you can't expect everybody to be good at everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right, I'll agree. And then there has to be somebody who has ownership for security, or at least a deeper knowledge to maybe do some threat assessment, or understand the impact of a particular risk that was identified in open source to their code base. So the security champion can be the go-to person on the individual team, but we see typical distribution in corporate environments, something like 100 different developers to maybe one person in the security department. Sometimes it's even worse than that. So the security champion basically takes the weight off of the central security team, and the security team can help them do their job, not only through providing access to training, but things like checklists. If you see something like this, it's probably okay to accept. If you see something like that, then you should probably come talk to me about it.
Mm-hmm. I think Vikram had a great point too, with product actually taking a little bit of a role in ownership in these. Increasingly, I had to go get a certification for privacy because somebody needed to do it, and I wasn't going to ask developers to. Product does have an increasing role, I think, in quality, security, privacy, the sort of oversight and regulatory, to at least provide some guidance, because our job shouldn't just be in product to sit there and write user stories, but provide that guidance and a lot of the how things get executed.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, Patrick and Jeffrey. There's one thing that I'm noticing on our side in terms of the cloud native teams that we are working with is the intent and the methods are differentiated right now. There's no, you cannot replace the security know-how and the knowledge base for the years of experience to bring to the table purely from a risk management perspective. The methods are quite changing from the perspective of what used to be, we would, those shall not pass to trust but verify models. Those are some things that we're starting to see people are embracing more openly. And that helps build individual champions downstream from a distribution perspective. Help me understand the intent, help me understand the risk, let me figure out what is the right way of doing these things is, and we'll come to the table and have a discussion. Those are kind of the cultural changes that are starting to notice around that. And especially when it comes to adoption of an open source project and things like that, the developer know-how of security is relatively, understanding is much more simplistic, whereas the security really brings some construct of business risk and impact and reputation and all of that that is invaluable to the conversation.
I mean, honestly, and that said, a good champion, the knowledge spreads, actually reduces your risk more by having somebody trying to, as Mitch, you put it, training, right? That knowledge spreading reduces your risk even more, the organizational side of risk, right? What if we lose this guy? So at the end of the day, champions, specialists, those are really, really good models in this DevOps cloud-centric world we live in.
Well, I think I agree with you too about the DevOps model. And one of the fundamental principles of that is not having control points or people who have all the information, all the control. So really a role like that should be almost a mentorship role, not a gatekeeper, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it should spread across a lot of different domains, but security is one where the knowledge is so time intensive to gain, it just is a natural fit for a champion or specialist role.
So in somebody performing a role like that, would you expect them to kind of keep tabs, keep an eye on the open source projects that we're using, being part of that evaluation process if you're going to bring in something new? Is that one of the functions a security champion might perform?
I would think they may be doing that anyways if they're part of a particular project team. They have to understand whether or not the update to the library is going to break their code already and whether they have to do any refactoring. So it would definitely be a natural follow-on for them to also be looking at the security fixes, not only from the direct library, but also the transitive libraries that library is using, whether there's a downstream import that'll end up causing them a problem later on.
And somebody has to make the assessment of, we may not be able to upgrade to the next whatever release of any code, open source code, and saying, okay, well then, is that an attack, a vulnerability we actually could have exploited in our software, right? So you got to keep tabs on. You're not going to fix everything.
It's not an easy answer, and you may have to try to balance security issues that are identified in the library versus your time to completely refactor, update your code. Looking at the severities that of the issues that are being pulled in.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share something from our research. Somewhere around 70% or so of vulnerabilities in open source code aren't called by any given project's code. In other words, right, that vulnerable method, you might not be using it. So knowing whether or not you're using it is a great way to figure out whether or not you need to mitigate that risk, as a high priority or a low priority.
I think what you bring is a very interesting point, Jeffrey, is that all of these have, regulated industries, all of these have compliance angles to that, right? They have the champion being very well versed with it's an issue, it's a critical issue, or it's not, has a serious implications towards the compliance posture of that particular application. Most of these compliance regulations have, mitigate all your step one issues, within 15 days, as an example, right? Having somebody knowledgeable in terms of both the impact and implications is really essential to be on that team.
Yeah, and the piece that I think we sort of inherently know but never really codify is not all applications are particularly sensitive. I care a lot more about making sure everything's fine in a pacemaker than I do in my latest mobile game. Everything touches everything else nowadays. That's how things work. But financial information, healthcare information, the normal regulated industries. Obviously, if you're dealing with that, you have to change your posture to be more conservative.
Well, let me throw this out. So these all sound like, since you guys aren't disagreeing with each other, I'm going to disagree with you. So these all sounds like valuable, important things to do. All of us, developers, a DevOps engineer, no matter who you are, security engineer, we're all faced with other pressures, right? These are sort of the good hygiene things we should be doing. How do we justify the time and make sure we're spending enough time doing these things as opposed to the list of things that our boss or the team or product manager, to pick on you, Jeffrey, how do we make sure, we're actually doing the things we should be doing as well as what we're being asked to do?
Build your list of FUD.
Yeah, I mean, look, preventing problems is always going to be a harder case to make than solving problems that exist. Just is, because that's just how humans are wired. We see an issue, we want to fix it. If we don't see an issue, we don't want to fix it. So that's the key: visibility. Letting the decision makers know, hey, half of our libraries that we use are out of date. A quarter of them have vulnerabilities. We should probably mitigate that risk. Giving that visibility to the decision makers. I mean, I can tell you, if one of my developers came to me and said, hey, this product we have, half of the open source libraries have, Sev1 vulnerabilities, it is not going to be a debate about resources, whether or not we fix it. And that's the key. Visibility creates the urgency.
Mm-hmm. And to Jeffrey's point, not just the vulnerabilities, but as he said, the out-of-date libraries, because that can start to be an indicator of either the practices of the development team or maybe whether or not that particular open source project has kind of, fizzled out.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add to that conversation is I agree with both of you in terms of visibility bringing into right and front center of the issue. Visibility brings risk adoption and risk absorption. Somebody needs to sign off on that risk. The reality is that you're dealing with too many of them. The reality of any particular team in terms of the work structure perspective, you're dealing with too many of them. To give you to quote like the Equifax example, it's not that Struts Apache vulnerability was not known. It was known, but it was not prioritized, right? Have an understanding and overlay in terms of the impact of you're running a critical vulnerability within your core infrastructure that is front facing. That brings a sense of impact assessment to that, so you can really prioritize on the issues that bring the reputation and the risk for front and center, right? There is an inherent risk and there is an immediate risk, and that's the key, is to figure out which one is that you're working on.
And I think the key there is more visibility. Make somebody decide and make that decision visible. If you're a developer and you're going to the boss and saying, hey, we have vulnerabilities, and he goes to the director of product, let's say, and says, hey, where do we want our risk level? That should all be documented, visible. Somebody somewhere needs to make that call and write it down.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I think as an organization, you start to bring up a culture of, we are making decisions based on risk, not just based upon, I want to push more features out at that point.
Yep. And the more you're scanning, the sooner you can get visibility to that, and especially when you've got transitive dependencies that you don't even know about. As soon as you do your build, they're pulled in from whatever package manager, and the scan yesterday versus the scan today are totally different. So,
just share with you two things I have experienced as the receiver of, and you can comment if you think these are good ideas. One time, not getting right attention on some vulnerabilities, and I had a developer come to me and say, we have this issue, this vulnerability, and here's my code, and I proved we have it. I can exploit it. That'll get your attention. Another is to negotiate. If you want feature X, Vikram, then I need to fix this at the same time. I'll take on your request if I can also get this into the next sprint or whatever. Sound like good ideas?
I think Vikram just nodded his head no.
Good. You can disagree if you want.
Trade-offs.
It's always a fine balance between both. One of the things that we do internally is anything that has security implications gets its own review item within a sprint, so that we are collectively accepting the risk. Because end of the day, when you look at it from a developer standpoint, in best interest, they're bringing up the issues. If it does not necessarily get the backing of the organization and standing behind that, this is only as good as documenting it, right?
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, let's. We have about 10 minutes left in our webinar, and thank you for the questions from our participants too. We'll get to as many of those as we can. Want to peel apart this idea around automation. It's sort of, mother pie, apple pie motherhood kind of idea. But how do we break down? So we want to automate as much as possible. What do we automate, and where do you start? If you aren't automating sort of your security posture and understanding that or fixing it, what do you do first?
So there's lots of different integration points, and everybody's familiar with shift left. So some companies are really focused on shifting left as much as possible. You can't necessarily always do that for open source because your open source components are typically pulled in during the build process. So one of the places to integrate would be with the build server, and then perhaps also with your artifact server. So where are you storing your production candidates before they're deployed? You may be doing builds and then at the end of the process, putting them into a container. So if there's a place where you're storing your containers, go scan the containers as well before those are deployed. You can certainly enable developers, going all the way back to the left to, query a database or something like that so they can make a decision before they even start building software. I mean, that would be the ideal state is that snapshot in time, I'm going to use it or not. But from an automation perspective, the build server is typically one of the best places to do that.
Mm-hmm. So
I mean,
start with the build service, start with also where your, GitHub, Bitbucket, whatever you're keeping your artifacts in, correct?
And I think we actually touched a little bit on the farthest left, which is open source library selection, right? At the end of the day, it's a lot easier to prevent problems than it is to fix them. And being very mindful of what you bring in and having some sort of procedure around that will just always help. That said, big fan of automating inside the CI/CD pipeline. The one thing I always caution people is also automate some visibility in there, because otherwise it becomes this sort of set and forget thing and you go, great, we're all set. And that's not good. You don't want to automate it into invisibility. If you can, surface reports, surface, this is the percent of outdated libraries, send them to the right people. Just automate the visibility, not just the scanning and remediation.
Interesting.
The one thing I like to add is if you think about the DevOps infinity diagram, it's what you have is very important. I think to Jeffrey's point and Patrick's point, the build server being able to have an adoption policy around what you really bring into the table, what do you really have, how is this inherently risky, understanding in terms of getting a build scan. But to give you guys an example, in our case, we build probably 100 images a given day. The number of images that you bring into the table and probably 10% of those actually make it into production from a release and a deployment perspective. Where it ends up and how it operates, what environment it operates in, what is the risk perspective of, is it front facing, is it a middle tier, what kind of compensating controls are in place to be able to protect those inherent vulnerabilities also becomes important. Shift left is great to stop in terms of what gets into your environment. Things do change over time. Vulnerabilities get released every day. What's running, an inventory of what's running, a visibility into how it is operating, where it is operating also becomes really critically important to be able to understand what is the current nature of your risk.
How about the operations, the ops side of this? We talk about shift left, but of course, what's happening in production? What are the kind of automation, visibility into that should the dev team have?
We're all waiting for the other guy to answer. We're like,
1,000 points for Mitch.
I'm thinking of lots of things that aren't necessarily related to open source. So.
Yeah, a lot of those things are related to open source and also in the behavior of those components in production. One of the things that we do on our side is in the runtime security of things is very interesting. A critical set one vulnerability within an environment is really critical, but if it does not have any exposure, it does have a compensating control to that. At the end of the day, everybody is optimizing for that one sprint or 2-week release window. What can you get done when this 2-week release really needs to be prioritized there? And having a real world perspective of in terms of the impact and how it actually affects your organization is a loop that you need to complete end of the day. Being able to do it far, shift left and far right, and however you want to call it, both of those are interestingly balancing angles that you need to bring to the table. So both are necessarily diagonally opposite, but they're interrelated to each other to bring that infinity into play, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point because, look, we all know the equation for risk, right? It's impact times likelihood. And I think we tend to forget about the impact piece. And it's kind of what I was talking about earlier, too. Knowing what your risk profile is and where you want to draw that line dictates a lot of other things, including how much policy and procedure you put in place, how much you put onto the devs for understanding what's going on. It really does depend. It's the worst answer ever, but it depends.
That's where you started, I think.
So, Mitch, having a minute or two to think about the question now, if we look at shifting right in operations, I think it's important to know, as Vikram was saying, you're going to have lots and lots of builds, but it's really about what actually makes it into production. What was your production candidate that was actually deployed? And then having some sort of, monitoring ongoing about new vulnerabilities that were released on the open source libraries that you know are actually deployed into production. So you don't necessarily have to go back and do a rescan of everything running in production all the time, but at least have something pop up for the developers. Hey, there's a new vulnerability in, struts 2.5, and you need to go back and pull that stuff out of production or patch what's running, what have you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we have about 5 minutes left, 4 minutes. What I'd like to do is have each of you, you come from this from your own unique perspective. You could say bias because the companies that you work for, as well as your experience. But if you could suggest to our listeners, to our audience, what is for you the most common mistake or thing that might be overlooked when considering open source security in your use in your software? What do you see happening, and what would you suggest? And if there's a bias, because it's about your company, tell us that. Who would like to go first?
I'll go.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Vikram.
Yeah, I think open source is great. It really brings, and if you could, going back to the original conversation, it brings the velocity of a lot of Lego blocks you can adopt to really build up the big Lego model that you can take it to market and sell. In our case, we use Docker, Kubernetes, great projects, bring a lot of velocity of operations. Having a good life cycle model around open source is important. From our perspective, our philosophy has been you got to do both shift left, being able to understand in terms of what you're bringing into production, but also in terms of operationalizing it for far right to really understand the impact of these inherent risks that you're accepting as part of that. And our philosophy has been it's a complete life cycle problem, both from build and runtime perspective, not just the build aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it goes back to the real basics, and we hit on this. Know what is in your inventory. I'm still shocked, and I mean shocked, that basically no one seems to know what's in their software. That's where everything starts. And then once you have that, just be careful who you invite into your house. Mm-hmm. Metaphorically.
Okay.
Jeffrey said nearly identically the same thing I was going to say. But
I'm glad I went first.
Yeah. Yeah. To echo what he said, I work with a lot of customers that have absolutely no idea what's in their inventory. They may know some of the direct imports, the direct inclusions, but when they start seeing some of those transitive things that were pulled in by other open source projects, that's when everything goes off the rails. So definitely have a mechanism to look up those libraries, have it automated to get visibility, have all those reports, as we talked about before, escalated up to management, so everybody's on the same page. You can certainly make some risk assessments around whether you're using vulnerable methods, and that may help with your triage, but sometimes at the end of the day, and I think it was Vikram that brought it up earlier, there are compliance requirements, or there may even be regulatory requirements. So even if you're not using that vulnerable method, you still have to go replace that library because it's got a high sub issue in it. But yeah, visibility, I think, is the top issue here.
And okay. Just to follow up on that, keep everything up to date. It's not that hard. You can automate it. Keep up to date.
More the better. Well, I'd like to thank all three of you in the spirit of whose line is it anyway? I think, Patrick, you win. You win our competition. So I'd like you to do an improv on the credits on the outro. If you don't want to do that, I'm happy to fill in for you.
Let's just say improv was never one of my big strengths, Mitch.
All right, I'll take it for you. Thanks to all
I'd
three
be
of you.
surprised if the security guys had good improv skills, honestly, right?
You never know. Don't count it out. Okay, Patrick McNeil, Solution Architect with Veracode. Jeffrey Martin, Director of Product with WhiteSource, and Vikram Verakantam with Head of Product with Lacework. Thank you, all three of you. It's been an excellent discussion. I've really enjoyed both talking with you and listening to your thoughts and input on this topic. Very important topic. I want to remind our audience that we will send out a email with a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as the ebook on open source security. Thank you for joining us today. We know your time is very valuable, and we appreciate that you spent this hour with us. This is Mitch Ashley with Security Boulevard, DevOps.com, Container Journal. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, and be careful out there.
Thanks, Mitch.